Welcome back, everybody. Our next speaker is Geraldine Finlayson, who gave a talk yesterday, but I'll read her bio again in case some of the people watching this on YouTube haven't seen yesterday's. Geraldine has been an active researcher for over 30 years, during which time she has authored or co-authored over 60 peer-reviewed publications and has presented over 30 papers at international conferences. Dr. Geraldine Finlayson is Managing Director and Director of Heritage and Environmental Services at the Gibraltar National Museum and World Heritage Site Coordinator of the GORHAM'S Cave Complex, UNESCO World Heritage Site. She is Adjunct Professor at Liverpool John Moores University and a Research Fellow at the University of Gibraltar. Geraldine.
Hello, everyone. So I thought I'd start the talk today with a photo or a painting that some of you may have seen. It's actually a reconstruction of what Gibraltar may have looked like maybe 40, 50,000 years ago. Sorry, yes, 40, 50,000 years ago. A time when there were leopards, and according to this artist, and a gannet colony at the base of a cliff, and this is the great sand dune at the back of the rock. And I thought I'd put that in first because I wanted to sort of set the scene, if you like, and then ask the question, why do we think that this is the way it looked like? What sort of evidence do we have for this? So I'm going to give you an ecological overview of the World Heritage Site. Now, Gibraltar was inscribed onto UNESCO's World Heritage List in July 2016. It covers, the World Heritage Site of Gibraltar covers an area of 28 hectares from sea level caves on the east side of the rock to the top of the Mediterranean steppes at O'Hara's, which is 426 meters above sea level. The UNESCO cultural criteria number 3 is the criterion that was used for its naming, and it reads, Gorham's Cave Complex provides an exceptional testimony to the occupation, cultural traditions, and material culture of Neanderthal and early modern human populations through a period spanning approximately 120,000 years. This is expressed by the rich archaeological evidence in the caves, the rare rock engravings at Gorham's Caves, dated to more than 39,000 years ago, rare evidence of Neanderthal exploitation of birds and marine animals for food, and the ability of the deposits to depict the climatic and environmental conditions of the peninsula over this vast span of time. The archaeological and scientific potential of the caves continues to be explored through archaeological research and scientific debates, providing continuing opportunities for understanding Neanderthal life, including their capacity for abstract thinking. And although it was inscribed under the UNESCO's cultural criteria, the World Heritage Site also contains unique topography and geological features, as well as natural cliff vegetation, rocky shoreline communities, which we know have existed since the time of the Neanderthals. The statement of outstanding universal value, which is what UNESCO looks for when it awards the status of a World Heritage Site, goes on to say the attributes that express this outstanding universal value are the striking cluster of caves containing intact archaeological deposits that provide evidence of Neanderthal and early modern human occupation of Gibraltar and the landscape setting which assists in presenting the natural resources and environmental context of Neanderthal life. So, for those of you who are unfamiliar with Gibraltar, Gibraltar lies at the westernmost extreme of the Mediterranean Sea, and it's a tiny rocky peninsula jutting out of the sea. As I said, it's not extremely high, it's 426 meters high. And in the map in the center, you can see the World Heritage Site shown in dark green, and in a lighter shade of green is the buffer zone to the World Heritage Site. Now, the buffer zone provides a repository and apart from being a buffer to the World Heritage Site, but it's a continuation of a lot of the evidence that you can find within the site itself. Okay, so we're going to be looking today at several points so that we can try and see how the picture of the ecology of the World Heritage Site and what this meant for the Neanderthals who occupied Gibraltar at the time. So we're going to be looking at the bioclimatic conditions and habitats occupied by Neanderthals at Gibraltar during the late Pleistocene. GORHAM'S, Vanguard and Ibex caves, which are within the World Heritage Site, as well as data from Devil's Tower Rock Shelter, will be used. The unique level of detail which has enabled a fine-grained reconstruction of a Neanderthal world. We know that about 80% of this world that the Neanderthals experienced is now submerged, and we'll talk a little bit about that. The ecosystem was situated in a thermo-Mediterranean sub-humid bioclimatic regime even during the coldest episodes of MIS 4 and 3. Plants, mollusks, amphibians, reptiles, birds and mammals bear testimony to the existence of an important glacial refugium, and the great biodiversity of the Gibraltar Peninsula offered a range of food resources and hunter-gathering options for the Neanderthals who occupied the site for a minimum of 100,000 years. So this is the Rock of Gibraltar, taken from a plane. I was coming back from London. I was fortunate to have a window seat, and the photographic opportunity was amazing. I wasn't in a helicopter or anything like that. This is just from the aeroplane. But it gives us an opportunity to see where the main caves are located. So we've heard already people talking about Forbes Quarry. Forbes Quarry is at the foot of the northernmost part of the rock. That's where Gibraltar 1 was found. The Devil's Tower Rock Shelter is very close by, and that's where Gibraltar 2, the child's skull, was found. Then there's Ibex Cave at the top of the Great Sand Dune. Hyena Cave within the World Heritage Site. Vanguard Cave next to it. GORHAM'S Cave, only a short distance away. And Bennett's Cave. All these are within the World Heritage Site. And then there's Beefsteak Cave and Europa 2, which are just outside. And all these are of the 200 plus caves that there are identified in Gibraltar. These caves that I'm showing you here are the ones that have either Neanderthal remains or evidence of Neanderthal occupation. So the deposits in GORHAM'S and Vanguard's caves, which make these so spectacular and unique caves, cover a period of between 127 to 10,000 years ago, 127,000 to 10,000 years ago. That's the period that we're looking at, and I'll explain why in a second. And for greater part of this time, these caves were occupied by Neanderthals. And in the inset photograph, you can see a close-up of the GORHAM'S cave complex caves, which are at sea level, and which are the ones that I'm referring to at the moment. They're all within the World Heritage Site. Now, you've all heard of the ice ages, and one of the impacts and these variations of between hot and cold climate change isn't a thing that's new and affecting us. It's something that's been happening for many, many thousands of years. But the last time that the temperatures were similar to the temperatures we have today was about 125,000 years ago. And between that time and today, you can see this is a curve that shows the different sea levels relative to the present. And you can see that there's been a lot of variation over the 125,000 years that you can see on the graph. And that is the level today. You can see when it was last at that point. And the average the 80 is, it's just coincidence, it keeps happening, but for 80% of the time, the average sea level was about 80 meters below the present time. It's just a coincidence, nothing more to be read into that. And this was the point of the last glacial maximum, when it got coldest and when all the water was being trapped in the ice caps at the north and south poles, extending well into Europe and well into the North American landmass, and therefore that water, which was being drawn from the sea, meant that the sea levels dropped significantly, up to about 120 meters below present sea levels. So what effect did that have on Gibraltar? Well, the little grey shape at the top, that's an outline of the Rock of Gibraltar, pretty much as it is today. And you can see that this is the 20-meter contour, the 50-meter contour, the 80-meter contour. Did I do that? Oh, it's back. Okay. And the 100-meter contour, okay. And this is just the bathymetry of the rock as it is today, so you can see that where the black dot is on the grey mass that's representing Gibraltar today, that black dot shows the position, more or less, of where Gorham's Cave is. And as you can see, if you're facing eastwards from the cave, there would have been quite a substantial landscape which would have been uncovered as sea levels lowered. So what sort of landscape would you have been looking at? Well, let's look at the great sand dune. As the sea levels went down, what you see, if you take the water out, and I've tried to represent the land with that sort of grey or beige, the easterly winds would have been blowing over this exposed set of sand dunes and would have been blowing the sand up and forwards. And when the sand hit the rock, it would have started rising, and this has given rise to the Great Sand Dune. So that's, if you like, the genesis of that sand dune that you see on the eastern side of the rock. Of course, that sand dune is no longer active. It's almost solid. You still get the surface, you get runoff when it's raining and that sort of thing. But obviously, this is now a fossil sand dune, and it's no longer active. Plus, we've decided to build a road that cuts through the base of it, so it doesn't function as a sand dune anymore. Plus, there's no sand on the other side, in the sea. Okay. Now, why am I showing you a picture of hyenas? Well, hyenas are part of the, if you like, one of the most common predators that we're finding in the fossil record. And we're very lucky because hyenas are animals that consume pretty much all of their prey. They eat not only the muscle, the flesh, they also eat a lot of the bone of their prey, which means that a lot of calcium is contained in their droppings. And that means that when their droppings are left in the sediments, they tend to have this ability to fossilize very quickly, and they become what are known as coprolites. Now, this is a coprolite which dates back to about 50,000 years ago, give or take 10,000 years. And the little inset at the top is a photograph of a pollen grain. Now, because there's so much calcium in these coprolites, the pollen that the hyena has ingested by eating herbivores, for example, if it's eaten, I don't know, a red deer on the sandy plain and the red deer has been eating grasses, the red deer will have ingested pollen. And then the hyena, when it eats its prey, the red deer that has been eating pollen, it will also take it into its intestine, and therefore it finds itself in its droppings. And this is good news for us because we can identify the species of the plant that's produced that pollen, and that helps us to start drawing a picture of what plants were around when this hyena was alive. And we can produce a table like this. This is just for, just so you see how we put it together. I'll give you the detail in a minute. I know that the letters are a bit difficult to see. But it just gives you an idea of the results and how much information we can get from the pollen. So some of the plants that we get are heliophytes. In other words, they're plants that like warm conditions. And I've listed a few of the Latin names of the pollen that has been identified that are from species that like these kinds of conditions. We include Genistes, we include Buxus and Calicotomi, and these are species that are still found here today. Then we also find, apart from pollen, there's what are referred to as non-pollen palynomorphs, and this is just a name for microscopic objects of between 10 to 250 microns, with a characteristic morphology that's resistant to decomposition process and standard palynological laboratory treatments, so they can also be used as paleoecological indicators. Now, essentially, what this tells us, these are some of the non-pollen palynomorphs, but what this tells us, this suggests that there might be a presence of stagnant water that the hyenas have either drank themselves or they've transported on wet fern, that sort of thing. Again, these are little clues that help you pick up what the environment would look like. Other types of vegetation surrounding the caves would include the pine, the stone pine in particular, oaks, junipers, the pistacias and mixed woodlands. And there'd also be plants that are associated with savannas and more open woodlands, river and forest patches, heliophytic matorrales, rocky scrubs, grasslands, shrubbery grasslands, and steppe-like salt marshes. So other kinds of vegetation, as I mentioned, there'd be the savannas with pine, oak, and juniper. I remember many years ago, one of the specialists that we were working with sort of queried the fact that we felt that there were trees associated, such as the pines and oaks, associated with sand. And they said, you know, you can't have sand and trees growing on them. And we sort of showed them other areas in the southern part of the Iberian Peninsula. One of them that we've often used as a proxy is the Doñana National Park, where you get precisely that. And the stone pine, although it's a tree, it grows very quickly, and it's the only tree that can actually survive in sand dunes because it grows faster than the sand dunes move. And there are other species of oak, such as the evergreen Quercus ilex or rotundifolia or coccifera, and we found evidence of these as well. We've already mentioned the Pinus pileata stone pine. Other vegetation would be more like the deciduous and mixed forests, Quercus virginia, Quercus suber, pyrenaica, and a number of others. And these would be denser forests and would give shelter to animals such as the wild boar and animals that prefer to have a more dense vegetation. And these forests were probably widespread in the Pleistocene of the western mountains of the Strait facing North Africa. And then there's also forests that are associated with watercourses and ravines, and we also get evidence of these with Silex, Fraxinus angustifolia, Populus alba, Alnus glutinosa, and Frangula alnus, together with sedges, etc. And the abundance of chenopods is probably related with salt marshes, which is not entirely surprising considering we're so close to the sea. And pollen taxa, which are represented in zero helophytic communities of the littoral, are Tamarix, Withania, Frankenia, Plantago, etc. Again, a lot of these communities can be seen, or similar communities can be seen in the Parque Nacional of Doñana. And heliophytic shrublands, again, would have been abundant in spiny and brush-like legumes, like the cistus, the genista, the talina, etc. Right, the thermophilic character of the coastal communities is confirmed by the pollen occurrences of Mytinus europaeus, Ephedra fragilis, and Calicotomi villosa, etc., and to a lesser extent by Olea europea, Filaria, Angustifolia, Latifolia, etc. Again. Okay.
It's interesting you got Buclerum there.
Sorry?
Buclerum is there. It's interesting in the previous slide.
Yes, sorry, yes. And, yeah. Okay. Now, the purpose of this slide is to try and show you the two stages and how little the pollen signature has changed between them. So the top part of the graphic illustrates the savannas and woodlands that you would have found in the area of Gibraltar. So you have there plants such as Mesophilus pinus, you have deciduous quercus, and other kinds of vegetation, which, if you then compare it to the one on the lower part of the graphic, isn't that different from the savannas and woodlands that are present in the warmer stages. In fact, if you look carefully, there's only a small inclusion of Cryophilus pinus and coming in at the very end, and the Picea ibius. So if you think about it, there is very little difference in the pollen signature between the cold phases and the warmer phases, and we'll discuss that briefly later on. So putting it all together, without sort of going into too much detail, this is a selection of slides that illustrates the different kinds of landscapes that are associated with the different pollen signatures that we're getting. We know that there would have been shifting dunes, there would have been salt marshes, savannas, freshwater shallow lakes, stabilized dunes, coastal vegetations, stone pine and lentiscus woodlands. So it builds up the story and the picture of what the landscape would have been like at the time. So the vegetation landscapes of Gibraltar didn't experience meaningful changes in the Upper Paleolithic with respect to the Middle Paleolithic period. In other words, the time that the landscape associated with the Neanderthals isn't that different from the landscape that's associated with later periods. The Gibraltar region was a unique territory in its abundance and diversity of temperate and Mediterranean trees and shrubs during the MIS3 and the last glacial maximum. And this is of paramount importance from a paleoecological and biogeographical perspectives. And it's confirmed by the occurrence of Mytenus senegalensis, Withania, Periploca, Calicotomi, Osiris, in particular, Lycium and Myrtus, which is also found in southern and southeastern Iberia during the cold late Pleistocene. And importantly, it indicates frost-free conditions. So it indicates a warm climate in the region even during the cold phases of the Upper Pleistocene. And it supports the ideas about the importance of the paleotropical element in the composition of pre-anthropic shrub communities of the southeastern coastal mountains of Iberia. And taxa such as Mytenus, Myrtus, Filaria, and Buxus parallel deciduous quercus and the mesophytic forest optimum during the Middle Holocene. For example, Sierra de Gador and Almeria. Mytinus senegalensis, subspecies europaea, originally from tropical savannas, is a tertiary relict distributed in North Africa and the south of Iberia, in Malaga, Almeria, Granada, and Murcia provinces. And it's adapted to Mediterranean climates. And it's distinctly thermophilous in character. In other words, it likes warm conditions. And it's found in coastal shrublands and inland below 300 meters above sea level. But the plant record isn't the only part of the evidence that we can draw on to reconstruct this landscape. Gibraltar is a geological ecotone with a range from acidic sands to the most alkaline rocks, which would generate high ecological diversity analogous to the current Doñana National Park in southwestern Spain. So when we look at other sources of evidence, we can look at the record of vertebrates that we found in the sediments in Gorham's and Vanguard caves in particular, but also from the other caves I mentioned earlier. And so these vertebrates include Thermophilus herpetofauna. Fauna. Sorry, I'm having a moment. Basically, what I was saying is like reptiles and amphibians that like relatively warm conditions. The amphibian and reptile bone remains include more than 2,000 elements, representing at least 24 taxa, including newts, toads, frogs, tortoises, turtles, lacertid and synchid lizards, geckos, and several snakes. Incidentally, this is just a photograph of a tortoise. It's not the tortoise that we find in the fossil record, for those of you who know. But the presence of these animals, because they are so restricted to the temperature ranges in which they can lay their eggs and their eggs can hatch, means that it gives us a very good idea of what the temperature ranges would have been when we find them. The record also includes birds, the avifauna, from multiple biotopes. And I'm not going to go further into this because Stuart, who's going to talk after me, will expand more about all this. But 161 species have been identified from the Gibraltar caves, and he will expand on that later. Other vertebrates include small mammals like the greater white-toothed shrew, the Cabrera's vole, Mediterranean pine vole, the Eurasian pygmy shrew, the crowned common shrew, the Iberian mole, the wood mouse, garden dormouse, greater mouse-eared bat, the Natterer's bat, Schreiber's bat, and the southwestern water vole. And these suggest open, dry conditions with meadows under a seasonal climate change, open, wet conditions with evergreen meadow with dense pastures and suitable topsoil. They also suggest woodlands and mature forests, including woodland margins and forest patches with moderate ground cover. And they suggest water along streams, lakes, and ponds. As well as small mammals, there are other not so small mammals, the slightly larger ones. For example, the main one that we find in the record, it's very prevalent, is the rabbit, which is hardly surprising, but also the Spanish ibex and the red deer. Other mammals include the boar, the aurochs, which is, if you like, the ancestor of what today we refer to as cattle, the horse, and the narrow-nosed rhino. By way of predators, mammalian predators, you've got the Iberian lynx, which is still found in the Parque Nacional in Doñana, incidentally, the wild cat, the spotted hyena, the lion, the leopard, the wolf, brown bear, and the monk seal. Some of these are a bit surprising to see in the fossil record. You might ask yourselves, you know, is it right? Were there lions and leopards and hyenas in this part of the world? Well, the fact is that their ranges have restricted now, and you can only find them in Africa. But they were here at the time. And again, like supporting the information that's coming through from the pollen, we find that there's the total absence of cold fauna. So this far south on the European continent, this far south, it never got that cold. And there's no evidence of the woolly mammoth having come so far south, and there's no woolly rhinoceros either. There's a clear association between a Homo and ecologically rich, semi-open savanna-type ecotonal and mosaic landscapes, such as that's coming through in Gibraltar. Several analyses of both plant and animal remains support the view that thermicity was a crucial factor in the maintenance of this biodiversity stronghold. Blanc et al. Presented quantitative data on the terrestrial climatic conditions throughout the latest Pleistocene sequence of Gorham's Cave, using the amphibian and reptile assemblages. And the inferred mean annual temperatures were about 1.6 to 1.8 degrees Celsius lower than present day in this region, which is surprisingly little, really, if you think about it. While the winters would have been slightly colder and the summers similar to today. The mean annual precipitation was slightly lower, but the results showed that there were only 4 dry months during the latest Pleistocene, as opposed to 5 dry months today during the summer. Again, this is a slightly unexpected result, but this is what the amphibians are telling us and the reptiles. Excuse me. But there's also been work on limpets by Ferguson et al., which showed that the sea surface temperatures were giving a signal that seasonality was greater during the last glacial by about 2 degrees Celsius. Not that far from what the results from Blanc et al. So in summary, the climate was subhumid to semi-arid and thermo-Mediterranean. And Gorham's and Vanguard caves are currently at sea level, but during MIS3, they faced an emerged coastal shelf with a shoreline as far away as 5 kilometers at times, and sea level remaining on average about 80 meters below the present sea level, as we said before. And from all of the above, it's not surprising that Gibraltar may have represented a stronghold for Neanderthals and many other species during the late Pleistocene, acting as a refugium during the cold stages. So to finish, I'd like to just show you another reconstruction by... Sorry? Sorry. So to finish, I'd like to show you another painting by to finish, I'd like to show you another painting by Mauricio Anton. I started off with one and I'm finishing with another one. And this shows a view of Gorham's Cave when the Neanderthals were right at the back of the cave. We find, again, because he draws on the evidence of what we're finding in the archaeological record, what he's trying to depict is a possible scenario for what the back of the cave may have looked like when the Neanderthals were there. And so there's a hearth placed at the center of the painting, and that's meant to replicate, if you like, the evidence of a hearth that we found during our excavations, and which we were able to date, which takes us back to about 35,000 years ago. And here in the foreground, you've got 2 people, and if you look closely, they appear to be using a tool to gouge out something on the floor. And what we're trying to show here is a possible scenario of digging out the engraving that has made the headlines when we discovered the engraving that dates back to the Neanderthals. This engraving, excuse me, has been known recently or referred to recently as the Neanderthal hashtag. And while some people have suggested that it might be art, we've always stopped short of calling it art. But what we do know is that whoever decided to make this engraving, they took a deliberate decision to convert a thought that they had, which was a concept that they had in their minds, and to make a physical representation of that concept. Through experimental work, we've been able to demonstrate, and by taking very close photographs of the engravings, you can see that each line in the engraving took about 60 strokes, and the entire work would have taken between 1 and 2 hours to complete. So it's not an accidental image or engraving that was done by anyone. And I know I've been very quick and I've finished very quickly, but that's the end of my talk. And if anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to answer them, or try to anyway.
Thank you very much, Geraldine. Very interesting talk. Thank you. Before I ask the floor, we've got one question from Sheila Chiswell and Mary Thornton, who ask, you mentioned the term ecotone. What is this?
An ecotone is where two different ecological types come together. Sorry, I'm not really describing it very well. If you've got a woodland and you've got a prairie, the ecotone is the bit in between where they meet. So that's and it seems that humans have always been drawn to these areas where two different kinds of habitats come together. So whether it can be the shoreline with a marsh, or it can be a woodland with a river, and that's pretty much what I'm referring to.
Okay, thank you, Geraldine. Keith, do we have the microphone for questions? Over on that side, Keith. Thank you.
I'll say before I ask my question that as a birder, I'm always attracted to ecotonal habitat because I always think they're particularly rich. But I now wonder whether that's just my instinct as a human. But on to the question. I mean, I always find my imagination running riot when I sit through these presentations. And those illustrations are a really good way of imagining what Gibraltar might have been like. But anyway, going back to the vegetation in Gibraltar has obviously undergone significant alteration in the last few centuries. How useful is the archaeological record in informing what the vegetation would have been like right now in Gibraltar during the present climatic episode had it not been altered? And following on from that, do you think that this should inform management of habitats in Gibraltar?
I'm always very careful when I think about this, because it can be used as a guideline, but I don't think that the resolution that you have in the fossil record can give you a snapshot in time, although maybe inadvertently I may have suggested that. It gives you generalities, but it's difficult to tell what the precise presence would have been in a particular year. You're talking of periods of maybe 50, if you're really lucky, 50 years, but often it's about 500 years. And so it would be difficult to pinpoint. However, having said that, it does give you a guideline, because it does tell you what you could expect to find. So yes and no, I suppose, is the answer. But always take into account that it's not a precise, the resolution isn't there. I'd love it to be, but it isn't.
Further questions? Can we take one from Nigel and then one from Clive?
Geraldine, how easy would it have been for the fauna, particularly the larger animals that are now restricted to Africa, to travel northwards across the strait during the glacial maxima?
It would have been impossible. The time that we're looking at, Gibraltar and Africa are separated, and even at the height of the glacial maximum, when it's really, really cold and the sea levels are down by 120 meters, which is the maximum that it goes down to, the strait would still have been there, and the strait goes down to over 1,000 meters. So there has been talk, and maybe Darren may touch on this in his talk, but there has been some work to look and see what the tides and what the currents would have been like. So with the question being, could animals or humans have crossed the strait at that time? There's a moment, I don't know, Darren, if you're going to be talking about this, but there is a moment that's been calculated that the currents might actually have reversed. So at the moment, the Mediterranean Sea suffers from a lot of evaporation, and therefore the Mediterranean Sea is on the main saltier than the Atlantic. And therefore, water from the Atlantic flows into the Mediterranean at the present level, at the present time. It is possible that at one time when the thaw after the glaciations was happening and a lot of fresh water was pouring into the Mediterranean from all these ice caps that were beginning to melt, it's possible that the Mediterranean may actually have become less salty than the Atlantic. And in that situation, you may have had moments where the currents would either have been negative or even neutral. And it has been postulated that that it might have been easier to cross for large animals. But I think on the main, I work on the premise that at that time, in the last 130,000 years, there was no movement of mammals, larger mammals, land mammals obviously, from Africa into Europe.
So in other words, they were already there?
Yes. And then they died out because they couldn't be replaced, and because then there was probably pressure from humans as humans settled in Europe and expanded. But, you know, I always think that even Aesop's fables talks about a lion, with a thorn in its paw. And so it's possible that lions held on for quite a while in Europe. And certainly in North Africa, in Morocco, there were lions until only a few tens of years ago. So, it's just nowadays that we tend to think of hyenas, lions, and leopards being African species.
Yep, just to follow on from that, to highlight that actually of those species, only the spotted hyena is currently restricted to Africa. Lions are still found in India. The highest densities of leopards in the world arguably occur in Asia and not Africa. And in fact, lions were found in northern Greece during the classical period. So yeah, what we're seeing are vestiges, but it doesn't necessarily reflect their true ranges. There are still leopards in Israel, for example.
Yeah, that's right.
Further questions? Darren, you can...
No, just to follow up on Geraldine's earlier comment, because I was having quite a bit of a dilemma about how much to include in my talk without it going into about 3 hours. So, and I ended up not including the crossing of the strait. but just to say that crossing the straits depends on what you're talking about and what kind of animal you're talking about. Certainly, I know people would have to train sufficiently, but the straits are crossed even today in about 5 hours on average by people swimming. And even on an annual basis, the actual current flow in the straits decreases in winter because of the increased sort of rainfall, etc. So yes, there's a good case for that, plus the fact that the straits would have become significantly narrower with the dropping of the sea level, and even some islands would have appeared. So you would have had crossings of maybe no more than 5, well, in some cases 5 kilometers, 10 kilometers, but we're not talking about the 20 plus that we have now. I have done some modeling. The interesting thing about it is that you've got a far greater chance of crossing the further to the west you jump into the water, even though it's wider. Because here in the Straits, if you just push slightly into the Mediterranean, then the coast falls away from you on both sides and you're very quickly caught up in the open ocean. But if you jump in, you know, beyond Tarifa, more like Camarinal, etc., and similarly in Northern Africa, you do have a relatively, you can cross. Now, whether you want to cross or whatever is something else. But if you're on a rafted bit of vegetation, etc., there is a possibility, and then you have to start arguing whether there's enough of you to actually start something else on the other side. You know, there's only one, then unless it's a pregnant female, you start coming into problems. So, or in terms of etc. So it's an interesting question. It's one that you could debate for a long time. Yeah, thank you.
Can I come back? Sorry, can I come back to trees? First, the discussion Jerry and Keith had about can you predict present day. I'm a bit more optimistic than Geraldine. I think you can establish from the record optimal conditions and vegetation. However, and this is some work I did with Pepe Carriano from Sierra de Bassa, and we looked at the vegetation record there in the Holocene. And what is remarkable, and this may support more the Geraldine's argument, is the degree to which already from the Chalcolithic and the Bronze Age, the degree to which we have been destroying the Mediterranean forest. So even 5,000-6,000 year old pollen record is anthropic. And let's not talk about by the time you get to the Romans, because then, you know. So with caution you might be able to, but there are these factors that need to be brought into account. But there are other things which we've been discussing recently with these guys, which I think maybe even for the discussion later might be worth doing, about some of the misconceptions we might have about the way some plants and trees behave. We're looking at, for example, there the occasional presence, I think it's in charcoal rather than pollen, of Pinus nigra. And we're saying it got colder. Well, why? Because Pinus nigra now you find in Casolda 1,200 meters. But it's behaving like that because of us. But Pinus nigra, I mean, for me a cold signal would be Scots pine, not necessarily black pine, and just because it's high up. And the other example is we've got, you know, people don't seem to realize this, but we've got abies, we've got pinsapos. Now, but the abies, the pinsapo, is not a cold, you know, relative to some of these colder pines. It's a relatively mild climate thing. So what you probably had in this region was a widespread distribution of pinsapos right down to sea level, and the pollen of pinsapo doesn't travel very fast. So if we're getting pollen pinsapo here, they were nearby. And what you have are relic distributions, which may happen to be in the mountains or whatever, but they're not really giving you anything to do with cold. It's just simply... So sometimes I think we're misunderstanding or misinterpreting the signals provided by trees because of present-day behavior, which may be confusing what, you know, the way they would have been behaving in a less anthropic world.
Question from Keith Bensusan.
A question following on from that is to what extent does the pollen record reflect the vegetation in the immediate surroundings of the site? Because if cedar pollen turns up in Iberia, for example, then do these records of black pine reflect black pine growing around the caves, or just that black pine was in all of the mountains surrounding Gibraltar, whereas now it's restricted to Sierra Nevada and the highest reaches of the Rif, for example?
The interpretation of the pollen record obviously is done by palynologists who take into account the different dispersal of pollen, because not all pollen travels as far. So there are some species that you will detect their pollen because it's been borne on the wind for a very long distance. There's others which settle very quickly. the thing that we use to, if you like, tidy up the signal is we look at pollen and then we also look at charcoal. Now, the charcoal from the hearths of the Neanderthals, if you like, can give us information about the vegetation that's close by. You're not going to walk for 5 kilometers with the fuel for your fire. You're just going to gather what's around your camp. And then there's also a pollen signature that comes from coprolites. And you can infer that most of the pollen that's ingested by the herbivore that has been eaten by the hyena has been ingested in the process of their range, if you like, when they've been grazing in their range. Now, so you add the range of the herbivore to the range of the hyena, and then it gives you an idea of sort of what sample area you've got for that kind of pollen. So the pollen from the sediments, the pollen from the coprolites, and then the evidence from the charcoal helps to narrow down or to put into perspective the species that you're detecting and the interpretation of what it is that you've actually got.
Question from Clive Finlayson at the front.
In some cases, like the Pinus nigra, has been, like Geraldine says, identified purely on charcoal. I think the separation of some of the pinuses on pollen is difficult. And Pinus pinae, if we're saying Pinus pinae, it's got to be charcoal, otherwise it's pinae stroke pinaster on pollen. So some of those are pretty clear. Abies, the pollen disperses very little. But we've had this discussion with cedrus. We get cedrus, and there's a lot of cedrus all across Spain. We cannot claim for sure that cedrus ever grew in the Iberian Peninsula. It's probably all North African pollen, because it's dispersed very widely. So you need to know the behavior of the pollen, air currents, all sorts of things. But you can narrow it down to some degree. I mean, I think I can be confident in saying it's certainly Pinus nigra. If it's charcoal, it was, there. Pinus sapo was probably very close, if not in Gibraltar itself. But things like cedars are much more difficult. It's one other thing, a misconception, while we're here chatting anyway, we have a few minutes if I may, that I grew up with, actually, reading all the old floras and vegetation, things like walnuts, juglans, castaner. These are Balkan species introduced into Spain historically. It's nonsense. They've been there all the time.
That was even the narrative with regard to olive.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
These things have been here all the time from the Pleistocene. Pinus pinae, even people say, well, they've been planted. Of course, Pinus pinae is planted now, but Pinus pinae is native. Pinus pinae is native. Juglans regia is native. Castanea sativa is native. This nonsense they were historically brought from the Balkans. It's absolute nonsense. And people still think it's true. And what it shows is these things have been growing probably in the two Mediterranean, Balkans and Iberia, maybe Italy as well, and have been there. Anyway.
Question from Keith and Susan.
One more question is whether there is sufficient data to compare the proportions at which plants turn up in the pollen record compared to in these hearths. Because obviously there would be a bias with regard to what they preferred to burn.
Yeah. You can draw some conclusions from the charcoal, but not from the pollen. It's very difficult. One pollen grain, how do you interpret how common that was? It's not normally done from pollen, but it is from charcoal.
Depending on how many pollen grains of one you find compared to the other, is that possible or is it not possible?
Not really. And the other thing that you have to take into account is the fact that pollen can travel at different rates in different conditions. So it doesn't give you you can't really use it as a tool. It's not, the resolution isn't there.
Do we have any more questions? We've got time for one more, I think. Any more questions? Okay, thank you very much. Geraldine, that generated a lot of questions and debate. Thank you.